I took a deep breath, grabbed my purse, and walked out in silence. My own daughter had just told me I wasn't worthy of sitting at the dinner table with her new family. She'd sent me to the kitchen like I was hired help, but she had no idea about the surprise I had waiting for all of them. That night, walking down the empty streets, I remembered the exact words of Preston Hayes, Simone's husband. His cold eyes pierced right through me when he said that a woman like me didn't deserve to share the dining table, that my place was in the kitchen, serving everyone else. Simone didn't say a word. She just looked down and pointed toward the kitchen door. Welcome to Martha's Stories. I share new life stories here every day, and I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe and liked my video. Now let's jump back into my story. I'm sure you'll love it if you keep listening till the end. My name is Aller Sterling. I'm 71 years old, and until 6 months ago, I was the wife of James Sterling, a man who loved me for 45 years. We lived in a modest ranch house filled with memories where we raised our only daughter, Simone. After James's passing, I thought my daughter would be my refuge, my company in these golden years. How wrong I was. It was the morning of the day that changed my life forever. I woke up early just like I always do. I fixed my coffee. The same simple black coffee James and I shared every morning for decades. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Simone did her homework as a girl, where we celebrated her birthdays, where James took my hand every morning before heading off to work. Simone had called the night before to invite me to a special dinner. She said she wanted me to get to know Preston better. They'd been married for 2 years, but I'd barely had a chance to speak with him. I was so excited. I thought we'd finally have a chance to be family again. I put on my favorite burgundy dress, the one James always said made me look radiant. I did my hair, applied a touch of lipstick, and even put on the perfume my daughter had gifted me for Mother's Day. I wanted to look nice for them. I wanted Preston to see that I was a dignified woman, a mother-in-law he could be proud of. I arrived at their high-rise condo in Buckhead at 7 due sharp. Preston opened the door with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was a tall man, about 40 years old, with perfectly slicked back hair and a suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my mortgage payments. From the first moment, I felt something strange in his gaze, like he was sizing me up. Simone appeared behind him, beautiful as ever, but there was something different about her. Her smile seemed strained, and she avoided looking directly into my eyes. She gave me a quick hug as if it were an obligation rather than a gesture of affection. The condo was stunning. Everything looked like it was pulled right out of a home decor magazine. Modern furniture, abstract art on the walls, a dining table that could easily seat 8 people. I felt small in that elegant space, but I tried not to show it. Preston offered me a glass of wine, but I asked for a glass of water instead. I didn't want to do anything that might make him uncomfortable. I wanted this night to be perfect. I wanted us to finally connect as family. For the first few minutes, the conversation flowed normally. Preston asked me about my life, how I was handling widowhood, and my plans for the future. I answered honestly, trying to sound positive despite the crushing loneliness I'd felt since James died. But then the guests arrived. 2 sleek, elegant couples, Preston's friends from work. They were all dressed impeccably, talking about venture capital, international travel, and expensive downtown restaurants. I tried to join in, but every time I opened my mouth, I felt like my words didn't belong in that setting. Dinner was served at the dining table. We all started to take our seats, but when I walked toward one of the chairs, Preston stopped me with a hand on my arm. His fingers dug into my flesh with a surprising amount of force. He smiled, but his eyes remained cold as ice. "Ellar," he said smoothly, "I think you'd be more comfortable in the kitchen. You can help serve the dinner there and won't feel out of place with our business conversations." The silence in the dining room was deafening. The guests exchanged awkward glances, but no one spoke. I looked at Simone, expecting her to say something, to defend me, or at least show some sign of disagreement, but she just lowered her head and mumbled something about how it would be better this way. She isn't worthy. Those were the exact words Preston used when one of the guests asked if I wasn't going to join them. A woman like me wasn't worthy of sharing the table with successful people, with people who truly mattered in society. I felt like I'd been slapped across the face. 45 years of marriage, 45 years of raising my daughter, of working hard, of being a respectable woman. And this man reduced me to nothing with a few cruel words. But what hurt the most was Simone's silence. My own daughter, the girl who had grown up in my arms, who I had comforted when she cried, who I had nursed when she was sick, was abandoning me when I needed her support the most. I grabbed my purse without saying a word. I walked toward the door while listening to Preston explain to his guests that I was a woman from another generation who didn't understand modern social dynamics, that it was better for everyone that I not participate in conversations that were above my level. Simone followed me to the door, but not to defend me, only to whisper an empty apology, to tell me to understand that Preston was right, that I didn't fit into that environment, that it would be better if we met another time, in a place more appropriate for me. I left that condo feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. Out on the street, the cold night air hit my face, and only then did I realize I was crying. Silent tears streamed down my cheeks as I walked aimlessly down the empty streets. I didn't have money for an Uber, so I just walked. I walked for hours, remembering every word, every gesture, every moment of humiliation I had lived through that night. I sat down on a park bench in Piedmont Park, the same one where I used to take Simone when she was little, where I taught her how to feed the pigeons, where she told me her dreams of being a princess. There on that cold, lonely bench, I realized I had lost my daughter forever. Not to death, as I lost James, but to something far worse. I had lost her to ambition, to money, to a man who had convinced her that I was worth nothing. I returned to my house after midnight, the modest house James and I had bought when we were young, where we had been happy for so many years. Now it seemed smaller than ever, emptier, quieter. I sat on the bed I had shared with James for decades. I still kept his pillow, and I could still smell his cologne on some of his shirts that I hadn't had the heart to donate. I cried until I had no tears left, until exhaustion took over. The following days were the hardest of my life. Simone didn't call. Not even a text message to ask if I had made it home safely. It was as if that one night had erased 48 years of history between us. I tried to stick to my normal routine. I woke up early, made my coffee, read the paper, watched my shows, but everything felt meaningless. Why get up if I had no one to share the day with? Why get dressed if I had nowhere to go? Pearl Davis, my neighbor for life, noticed something was wrong. She had been my friend for over 20 years. She had been there when Simone was born, when James got sick, when he died. She was the only person who truly knew me. One day, she knocked on my door with a freshly baked apple pie. She found me in my robe, unkempt, my eyes swollen from crying so much. Without asking anything, she walked into the kitchen, put on water for tea, and sat down to listen. I told her everything, every detail of that horrible night, every cruel word from Preston, every moment of silence from Simone. Pearl listened without interrupting, holding my hand when tears kept me from continuing. When I finished telling her everything, Pearl looked at me with that knowing wisdom only women of our generation possess. "Ah," she said, "you are worth more than all that man's money. You raised a wonderful daughter. You are an exemplary wife. You are a dignified woman. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." But her words, although well-intentioned, couldn't heal the pain I felt in my chest. It was a physical ache, as if a part of my heart had been ripped out. I had lost my daughter, the only family I had left, the only reason I had to keep going. Weeks passed, and I continued living like a ghost. I only bought what was necessary. I only spoke when it was essential. I existed without truly living. I would see other women my age with their children and grandchildren, and I felt an envy that shamed me. One afternoon, while going through the mail that had piled up in my box, I found something that caught my attention. A letter with the letterhead of a law firm addressed to me. I thought it might be something related to James's paperwork, some pending formality from his death. But when I opened the letter, my world changed forever. The letter was signed by Marcus King, an attorney downtown. It summoned me to his office to discuss a matter related to the estate of my great-uncle, Wally Jenkins, a man I barely remembered from my childhood. It said it was urgent and that he had been looking for me for months. At first, I thought it was a cruel joke or some kind of scam. Wall Alley had died when I was very young, and we had never had contact with that side of the family. But something about the formal tone of the letter, the professional letterhead, made me think it might be real. Pearl accompanied me to the attorney's office. It was an old building downtown with hallways that smelled of aged wood and yellowed papers. Marcus King was an older gentleman with gray hair and thick glasses, who greeted me with a kind smile. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, opening a thick folder filled with documents. "I apologize for taking so long to locate you. Your great-uncle, Wally Jenkins, passed away 2 years ago with no direct heirs. According to his will, you are the sole beneficiary of all his assets." I couldn't believe it. Wall Alley had been my grandfather's younger brother, a bachelor who had moved to Miami, Florida, when he was young. We never knew what became of him, and frankly, we never paid much attention. He was just a man who was occasionally mentioned in family conversations. Marcus explained that Wall-E had made a fortune in real estate. He had bought properties in the Miami area when prices were low, and over time, he had become an extremely wealthy man. He never married, never had children, and at the end of his life, he had decided to leave everything to his only living great-niece. The numbers he showed me were impossible to comprehend. Properties worth tens of millions of dollars, bank accounts, investments. It was more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. But what shocked me the most was discovering that among the properties were several apartment buildings right here in Atlanta. One of those buildings was exactly where Simone lived with Preston. The world stopped in that moment. Marcus continued talking about legal procedures, documents I had to sign, and the process for transferring the assets into my name. But I wasn't listening anymore. My mind was processing the cruel irony of fate. The man who had humiliated me, who had told me I wasn't worthy of sitting at his table, was paying rent in a building that now belonged to me. Preston, with all his arrogance and scorn, was technically my tenant. I left the attorney's office in a state of shock. Pearl had to take my arm to guide me to the bus stop because I was walking like a sleepwalker. It wasn't possible. Things like this didn't happen to women like me. Ordinary women who had lived simple, quiet lives. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake until dawn, reading every document Marcus had given me over and over again. It was real. Everything was completely real. Yara, the woman who wasn't worthy of sitting at the successful people's table, was now one of the wealthiest women in Atlanta. But with the initial shock came something darker. A feeling I hadn't experienced before, something that grew in my chest like a seed planted in fertile ground. It wasn't just relief about my new financial situation. It was something deeper, more visceral. It was the taste of justice. And I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. The next few days, I was in a strange state of calm. On the outside, I maintained my normal routine. I woke up early, made my coffee, read the newspaper. But inside, something had changed forever. It was as if a stronger version of myself had woken up after decades of sleep. Marcus explained that the legal procedures would take a few weeks. In the meantime, I could start familiarizing myself with my new properties, meeting the managers, and reviewing the lease agreements. He suggested I hire a professional manager to take care of everything, but I had other plans. I decided I would handle my properties myself. I wanted to know every detail, every tenant, every aspect of the business. It wasn't just about the money. It was because I needed to fully understand the power I now held in my hands. I started with the building where Simone lived. It was a modern 20-unit complex located in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, Buckhead. The current manager was a young man named Kevin Stone, who greeted me with a mix of surprise and nervousness when I introduced myself as the new owner. Kevin showed me all the records. Preston and Simone had signed a 2-year lease, paying a considerable amount each month. But what caught my eye the most were the notes in their file. They had been late on several payments and had recently requested an extension on the due date. It seemed Preston's perfect life wasn't so perfect after all. I asked Kevin to show me the exact apartment where they lived. From the manager's office window, I could see right out onto their balcony. It was strange to think that my daughter was in there, probably making breakfast or getting ready for work without knowing that her own mother was now her landlady. Over the following weeks, I established a routine. Every morning, I visited one of my properties, talked to the managers, and reviewed the financial reports. I learned more about the real estate business in 1 month than I had learned about anything else in years. But my main focus remained Simone's building. Kevin kept me informed of any news. I found out that Preston had lost a major client at work, that they'd had a loud argument with the upstairs neighbors, and that Simone had been calling in sick to her job more often than usual. Slowly, I began to see cracks in the perfect facade of their marriage. One afternoon, while reviewing contracts in the building office, I saw Simone step out of the elevator. She was thinner than I remembered, and there was something in her posture that reminded me of the insecure girl she had been as a teenager. She wore a green dress that was too big for her, and her hair, which had always been her pride, looked dull and lifeless. She stopped in the lobby to check her mail, and for a moment, I had the impulse to go up to her, to hug her, to tell her everything would be fine. But then I remembered that horrible night, Preston's cruel words, her complicit silence. Instead, I stayed in the office watching her. She had no idea I was there, that I now held the power to change her life with a single decision. It was an intoxicating and terrifying feeling all at once. That night, alone in my house, I made the most important decision of my life. I wasn't going to reveal my identity immediately. I wasn't going to confront Preston with yelling or threats. I was going to do something much more powerful. I was going to wait, observe, and act with the calculated coldness of someone who finally has control. The next day, I called Kevin Stone and gave him very specific instructions. From now on, I would personally handle all matters related to Preston and Simone's apartment. Any communication, any problem, any request, it all had to go through me first. Kevin seemed confused by my special interest in those particular tenants, but he didn't ask questions. After all, I was the owner, and I had the right to manage my properties however I wanted. I also hired a private investigator. I needed to know exactly what Preston's financial situation was, what his weaknesses were, where the cracks were in his seemingly perfect life. The detective's name was Derek Jones, a discreet, middle-aged man who had worked for many women in similar situations. Derek delivered his first report a week later. The news was even better than I had hoped. Preston had lost not one, but 3 major clients in recent months. He had made poor stock market investments and lost a considerable amount of money. Even worse, he had been lying to Simone about their financial state, keeping her in the dark as he sank deeper and deeper into debt. But there was something else. Derek had discovered that Preston was seeing another woman, a younger single colleague from work without the complications of in-laws that he considered a nuisance. They were meeting in upscale hotels, dining at exclusive restaurants, spending money he didn't have while Simone stayed home, increasingly isolated and confused. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because I finally had the weapons to destroy the man who had humiliated me. Sadness because my daughter was being deceived by the same man who had pushed her away from me. I decided it was time to start applying pressure. First, I instructed Kevin to be stricter with rent payments. No extensions, no special considerations. If the payment was even 1 day late, he was to apply the corresponding late fees as per the lease agreement. Preston called the building office the next day, furious. He had been used to being given concessions to being allowed to pay late without consequences, but now the rules had changed. Kevin, following my instructions, explained that there were new management policies and that there were no exceptions. I was in the office when Preston called, listening to every word of his conversation with Kevin. His voice, which had sounded so secure and arrogant that night in his condo, now held a tone of desperation that filled me with a satisfaction I hadn't felt in months. But this was only the beginning. I also started making small changes in the building that would specifically affect Preston. I hired a construction company to make minor repairs on the floor directly above his. Nothing illegal, nothing that violated the terms of the lease, but enough to cause serious inconvenience. Loud noises early in the morning during his important work calls. Interruptions in hot water service for a few hours every week. Small inconveniences that piled up to create an environment of constant stress. Meanwhile, I kept watching. Derek kept me informed of Preston's every move. His meetings with the other woman had become more frequent, but also cheaper. He could no longer afford luxury hotels, so they had started meeting in second-rate motel on the outskirts of town. Simone, for her part, had started showing signs that something wasn't right. Pearl, who had been clued into my situation, reported that she had seen my daughter at the grocery store obsessively comparing prices, buying cheaper generic brands, and using coupon apps. It was clear Preston had told her they needed to cut back, but without explaining the real reason. One day, while I was in the building office reviewing reports, I saw Simone step out of the elevator with red, swollen eyes. She had been crying. She wore the same ill-fitting green dress, but now she looked even thinner, more fragile. She approached Kevin's desk with a letter in her hand. It was a request to install an additional landline in the apartment, something that required management approval. While Kevin reviewed the request, I could hear her broken voice explaining that she needed a separate line to look for a job, that she wanted to help with household expenses. My heart broke right then. My daughter, who had been raised to be independent and strong, was being reduced to a shadow of herself by the very man who had sworn to love and protect her. But I also realized something else. Simone was starting to wake up. She was beginning to question Preston's lies, looking for ways to take control of her own life, and that gave me an idea. That night, after a lot of thought, I made a decision that would change the course of my plan. I wasn't going to wait any longer. It was time to start revealing the truth, but not the way Preston expected. I called Derek and gave him very specific instructions. I wanted him to arrange for Simone to discover her husband's infidelity, but in a way that looked completely accidental. I wanted her to see with her own eyes the kind of man she had married. Derek explained that it would be easy. Preston and his mistress had a predictable routine. Every Wednesday, they met at a coffee shop near her office and then went to a cheap motel on the outskirts. All we needed was for Simone to be in the right place at the right time. I also started preparing the final phase of my plan. I hired an accountant to review all the building's lease agreements. Officially, it was to optimize the property's finances. But in reality, I wanted to have all the legal documents ready for when the moment of truth arrived. Meanwhile, I kept applying pressure on Preston. The delays in rent payments had become more frequent, and every time he called the building office, Kevin had instructions to be less understanding, more rigid with the policies. One afternoon, Preston finally lost his patience. He arrived at the building office without an appointment, yelling and demanding to speak with the owner. He wanted to know why the policies had changed so drastically, why he could no longer have the same considerations he'd had before. I was in the office when he arrived, sitting at Kevin's desk reviewing documents. Preston didn't recognize me. To him, I was just an older black woman, probably an unimportant administrative clerk. He completely ignored me as he yelled at Kevin about his rights as a tenant. It was at that moment that I decided to reveal my first card. In a very calm voice, without looking up from my documents, I said, "Mr. Hayes, I think there's a misunderstanding. I am the owner of this building, and the policies have changed because I decided they should change." The silence that followed was absolute. Preston's mouth hung open, looking at me as if he'd seen a ghost. Slowly, very slowly, he began to recognize my face. You are," he stammered, unable to finish the sentence. I replied, closing my folder of documents and looking him directly in the eyes. "The woman who wasn't worthy of sitting at your table. Your landlady." Preston's face went from red to white in a matter of seconds. His eyes darted around frantically, as if he were trying to process impossible information. The older woman he had scorned, whom he had ordered to the kitchen like she was a servant, was now the person who controlled his home, his stability, his future. I slowly rose from my chair, maintaining the composure I had learned to cultivate during these weeks of preparation. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to make a scene. True power is wielded in silence, with control, with the certainty of someone who holds all the cards. "Kevin," I said to the manager without taking my eyes off Preston, "could you give us a few minutes alone?" Kevin left the office, closing the door behind him. Preston and I were left alone, separated only by the desk, but the real distance between us was vast. He was no longer the powerful man who had humiliated me. He was just a delinquent tenant facing his landlord. "Sit down," I said, pointing to the chair in front of the desk. My voice was firm, but not aggressive. I had learned that true authority doesn't need to be loud. Preston sat down slowly like a scolded child. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on his knees. "Mrs. Sterling, I didn't know that you were the owner." I completed his sentence. "No, of course you didn't. If you had known, you probably would have treated me very differently that night, wouldn't you?" I opened the folder on the desk and started pulling out documents one by one. Lease agreements, reports of late payments, records of complaints from other tenants. Every piece of paper I placed on the desk was another piece of evidence of his precarious situation. "I see here that you've been late on several payments." I continued, reviewing the documents with the same calm as I would a recipe, 3 this year to be exact, and according to building policy, after the 3rd late payment, I have the right to begin an eviction process. The color drained from his face again. "Please, Mrs. Sterling, can I explain? I've had some temporary issues at work, but everything will be resolved soon. I just need a little more time." I kept reviewing the papers unhurriedly, letting the silence fill the room. Preston shifted nervously in his chair, waiting for my answer. It was delicious to see the man who had made me feel insignificant now squirming with anxiety, waiting for my mercy. "I wonder," I finally said, "if these financial difficulties have anything to do with your new expenditures, the hotels, the expensive dinners, the gifts for certain people who are not your wife." If he had been pale before, he now looked completely gray. His lips moved without making a sound, like a fish out of water. "I don't know what you're talking about." I took a photograph out of my folder and slid it across the desk. It was an image Derek had taken the week before. Preston leaving a cheap motel with a young brown-haired woman. Both looked happy, oblivious to the fact that they were being watched. Preston picked up the photo with trembling hands. How? How did you get this? That's not important, I replied. What's important is that now I understand why you've been having trouble paying the rent. It's hard to maintain two relationships when you only have one salary, especially when that salary has decreased considerably in recent months. I leaned back in my chair and watched him in silence for a few moments. I could see the panic growing in his eyes, the desperation of a man realizing that all his lies were being discovered one by one. "What do you want from me?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Nothing for now," I replied. "I just wanted us to know where we stand. You humiliated me. You treated me like trash. You made me feel worthless. And now it turns out that your life, your home, your stability depend completely on me." I stood up and started putting the documents back in the folder, deliberately slow movements that prolonged his agony. "You can leave now, but remember this. Every decision you make from now on, every word you say, every action you take will have consequences because now I am in control." Preston stumbled to his feet. "Are you going to tell Simone about the photograph?" I stopped and looked directly at him. "That decision isn't mine to make. It's yours. You can tell her the truth like an honest man, or you can wait for her to discover it herself. But one way or another, the truth always comes out." He left the office like a ghost, dragging his feet, completely defeated. I stayed seated for a few more minutes, savoring the moment. It was the first time in months that I had felt completely at peace, but my work was just beginning. Over the next few days, I put the next phase of my plan into action. Derek had arranged everything for Simone to discover her husband's infidelity. It would be this Wednesday at the coffee shop where they usually met when Simone would casually arrive for a job interview that had been canceled at the last minute. I also started making other moves. I hired a cleaning company to do a deep clean of the building, including an inspection of all the units. It was a perfect excuse to enter Simone's apartment and see with my own eyes how my daughter was living. Kevin accompanied me during the inspection. The apartment that had seemed so elegant and perfect, that horrible night now looked very different. The expensive furniture was still there, but there were clear signs of financial strain. Unpaid bills piled up on the kitchen counter, appliances that had clearly been sold and replaced with cheaper models, empty spaces on the walls where expensive art used to hang. In the master bedroom, I noticed that the bed was only made on one side. The other side looked like it hadn't been slept in for days. It was clear Preston had been sleeping somewhere else, probably on the living room couch, or maybe not even at home. But what caught my attention the most was the small desk in the corner of the bedroom. It was covered with papers related to job searches. Simone had been applying for clerical work, customer service roles, anything that could help with household finances. My independent and educated daughter had been reduced to looking for survival jobs because of her husband's lies. That night, alone in my house, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. Sadness to see how my daughter had been manipulated and deceived. Determination because I knew I had the power to free her from this toxic situation. Wednesday arrived faster than expected. Derek called me early in the morning to confirm everything was in place. Simone's fake job interview had been set up. Preston and his mistress were keeping their usual routine and everything would unfold naturally. At 3 that afternoon, my phone rang. It was Derek. "It's done," he said simply. "Simone saw them. She's on her way home now, and she looks broken." I sat down in my favorite chair, the same one where James used to read the newspaper to me on Sunday mornings, and waited. I knew it wouldn't take long for me to get news of what had happened. An hour later, Kevin called me from the building office. There was yelling coming from Preston and Simone's apartment. The neighbors were complaining. He felt he should intervene. "No," I told him. "Let them sort out their problems. But if the situation turns violent, Call the police. That night, Pearl came to visit me with news. She had seen Simone leave the building with a small suitcase. She looked devastated, but there was also something different about her, a determination I hadn't seen in months. "Do you think she'll come to you?" Pearl asked me. "Eventually," I replied, "but first, she needs to process everything that has happened. She needs to understand that her marriage has been a lie from the beginning." I was right. Simone didn't come that night or the next, but I knew it was only a matter of time. 3 days after Simone discovered Preston's infidelity, my phone rang at 10 at night. It was her, Siav. Her voice sounded broken, tired, as if she had been crying for hours. "Mama," she simply said, and that word pierced my heart like a knife. Can I come see you?" "Of course." "My love," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the emotion I felt. "I'll be waiting for you." I hung up the phone and stayed motionless for several minutes. After months of planning, strategizing, and calculated moves, I was finally going to have my daughter back. But I knew this conversation would be the hardest of our lives. I made some chamomile tea, the same kind I used to give her when she was a little girl and had nightmares. I used the good mugs, the ones James had given me for our 20th anniversary. I wanted everything to be perfect, for her to feel at home, to remember that she had always had a refuge here. When I heard the doorbell, I took a deep breath before opening the door. Simone was standing on the threshold with a small suitcase and eyes swollen from crying. She looked so fragile, so lost that all my maternal instincts instantly kicked in. "Hi, Mama," she whispered. I hugged her without saying anything. I felt her trembling in my arms, just like when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. We stayed like that for several minutes in silence while I comforted her, as I had done so many times before. Finally, I led her to the living room and served her the tea. She held the mug with both hands as if she needed the warmth to keep from falling apart completely. "I'm so sorry, Mama," she finally said. "I'm so sorry for everything that happened. I'm sorry I allowed Preston to treat you like that. I'm sorry I didn't defend you. I'm sorry I was so blind." Her words filled me with a mixture of relief and pain. Relief because she was finally acknowledging what had happened. Pain because I could see how much she had suffered to reach this point. "You don't have to apologize to me," I told her gently. "You were also a victim of that man." Simone started telling me everything. How Preston had gradually begun to isolate her from her friends and family. How he had led her to believe that I was a negative influence in their life, that my presence made him feel uncomfortable in his own home. How he had controlled every aspect of her life, from her clothes to her friendships. That night at the dinner party, she said, tears welling up in her eyes, "I wanted to defend you. I wanted to tell him to shut up, that he had no right to treat you like that. But I was so afraid of his reaction, of what might happen to me later when we were alone." My heart broke when I heard this. My daughter had lived in fear for 2 years, walking on eggshells, trying to keep the peace at the expense of her own dignity and our relationship. And now I find out he's been cheating on me. Her voice continued, growing stronger. That while I was sacrificing for our marriage, he was with another woman, and all the financial problems he made me believe were temporary were actually caused by his spending on hotels and gifts for her. I didn't tell her that I already knew all this. I didn't mention the photographs or my role in revealing his infidelity. That could come later when she was stronger, when she could handle the whole truth. Instead, I listened to her, letting her vent, cry, and express all the rage and pain she'd been holding inside for months. It was part of the healing process, and I was willing to be her refuge for as long as she needed. "Can I stay here for a few days?" she finally asked. "I need time to think, to decide what I'm going to do with my life. This has always been your home," I replied. "You can stay as long as you need." Over the next few days, I watched as my daughter slowly began to recover parts of herself that she had lost during her marriage. She started eating better, sleeping more peacefully, and smiling occasionally. It was like seeing a wilted flower receive water after a long drought. Meanwhile, Preston had been calling constantly, sending messages and showing up at the building where they lived to beg Simone to come back. Kevin kept me informed of his desperate attempts to contact her. One afternoon, while Simone was taking a nap, Kevin called me with urgent news. Preston had arrived at the building completely drunk, shouting in the lobby, demanding to know where his wife was. He had bothered other tenants and had threatened to break into his own apartment. "Call the police," I told him, "and make sure there's a record of everything. His behavior is violating the building's residency rules." That evening, when Simone woke up from her nap, she looked more rested than I had seen her in weeks. We ate dinner together at the kitchen table, as we had done so many times when she was young. "Mama," she suddenly said, "I need to ask you for something important. Anything you need, my love. I need a lawyer. I want to divorce Preston, but I don't have money to pay legal fees. I know you don't have much, but if you could lend me—" I interrupted her, taking her hand. "Don't you worry about the money. I'll take care of all the legal expenses." Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you. I don't have a job. I don't have savings. I don't have anything." "You don't need to repay me anything," I said. "You just need to be happy." The next day, I took her to Marcus's office, the attorney who had handled my inheritance. I had decided he would be perfect to handle Simone's divorce. He was discreet, efficient, and experienced with complicated cases. Marcus received us with the same professional kindness he had shown me. Simone told him her entire story, from the psychological control to the infidelity and financial abuse. Marcus took detailed notes and assured her she had a solid case. "With the evidence we have," he told her, "we can request not only the divorce, but also compensation for emotional distress and an equitable division of assets." After the appointment, we walked through Piedmont Park, where I used to take her as a child. Simone looked lighter, as if she had dropped a huge weight from her shoulders. "Thank you, Mama," she said as we sat down on the same bench where I had cried that horrible night after the humiliation. "Not just for paying for the lawyer. Thank you for taking me back after everything that happened. You will always be my daughter," I replied. "No matter what happens, no matter what mistakes you make, you will always have a place in my heart and in my home." That night, while Simone slept peacefully in her old bedroom, I sat in my favorite chair and reflected on everything that had happened. My plan had worked perfectly. Preston had been exposed. Simone had woken up from her nightmare, and finally, we had a chance to rebuild our relationship, but I knew there was still a final piece of the puzzle. Preston wasn't going to give up easily. Men like him never do. And when he felt completely cornered, he would probably do something desperate. I was right. 2 days later, Kevin called me with alarming news. Preston had hired his own attorney and was threatening to sue the building for harassment and discrimination. He claimed I was using my position as the owner for personal revenge. It was time to reveal my last card. It was time for Preston to know exactly who he was messing with. Preston's legal threat arrived at the perfect time. I had already revealed part of my power, but he still didn't understand the full magnitude of what he was up against. His threats of a lawsuit for harassment and discrimination were the perfect excuse to show him the entire truth once and for all. I called Marcus and asked him to prepare a formal meeting, not at the building office, but at his law firm, with all the documents related to my inheritance laid out on the table. I wanted Preston to see exactly who he had decided to fight. "Tell his lawyer I'm willing to discuss his accusations," I told Marcus, "but tell him to bring all his evidence because I'll be bringing mine." 2. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday. During those days, I carefully prepared everything I would need. Not only the property documents for the building where he lived, but also the deeds to all my other properties, the bank statements, the private investigators' reports, and something else I had been saving for this exact moment. I also told Simone what I was planning. It was time for her to know the whole truth about my new financial situation. I told her everything. Wally Jenkins' inheritance, the properties, the fact that I owned the building where she had lived with Preston. Her reaction was exactly what I expected. First shock, then disbelief, and finally a mixture of astonishment and something like relief. You mean all this time, while Preston was humiliating you and treating you like trash, you were technically his landlady? She asked, an ironic smile appearing on her face for the first time in weeks. That's right, I replied. And now he's threatening to sue me. Poor man. He has no idea what he's about to discover. Friday arrived like a storm that had been brewing for months. Marcus had prepared the conference room at his firm with all my documents meticulously organized on the table. When I arrived, Preston and his lawyer were already there. A young, nervous man who clearly didn't know what he had gotten himself into. Preston looked terrible. He had lost weight, had deep circles under his eyes, and his suit, though expensive, looked wrinkled and sloppy. It was clear the last few weeks had been a living hell for him. Mrs. Sterling, his lawyer began in a tone meant to be intimidating, my client has serious accusations to make against you. You are using your position as the owner for personal harassment and revenge. This constitutes discrimination and abuse of power. I sat down quietly in my chair without responding immediately. Marcus had advised me to let them speak first, to let them dig themselves deeper into their own ignorance before revealing the full truth. Preston took the floor, his voice trembling slightly. You've been persecuting me ever since you found out I'm your daughter's husband. You changed the building policy specifically to hurt me. You hired workers to make disruptive noise. You've been inflexible with the rent payments in a way you never were before. All of this, his lawyer continued, constitutes a clear pattern of harassment. We are prepared to sue not only for compensatory damages, but also for punitive damages. When they finished speaking, silence filled the room. Marcus looked at me, waiting for my signal. I simply smiled and began to open the folders I had brought. It's interesting. I finally said that you talk about harassment and persecution because I have also been documenting a pattern of behavior. But before we get to that, I think there are a few things you need to know about me. I pulled out the first document, the certificate of ownership, not just for the building where Preston lived, but for 4 other apartment buildings in the same area. Preston's lawyer leaned over to read it, and I could see his expression gradually shift from confidence to confusion. As you can see, I continued, I am not just the owner of one building. I own a considerable portfolio of real estate in this city. I pulled out the next set of documents, the bank statements showing balances of several $million. The young lawyer audibly swallowed. Also, I added, I have considerable financial resources, which means I can afford the best attorneys in the city if someone decides to legally challenge me. But the final blow came when I pulled out the folder containing all the private investigators, photographs and reports, the images of Preston with his mistress, the records of his spending on hotels and restaurants, the complete documentation of his infidelity and his financial lies. Now, I said, scattering the photographs on the table, let's talk about harassment and inappropriate behavior. Preston went pale as a ghost. His lawyer picked up one of the photographs and stared at it with growing horror. These photographs, I explained calmly, document a pattern of infidelity dating back several months. During this time, Mr. Hayes has been spending money he didn't have to maintain an extramarital relationship while lying to his wife about their financial situation. I pulled out more documents, records of Preston's expenses, evidence of his investment losses, reports of his employment problems. I also have evidence that he has been deceiving my daughter about their true economic situation, making her believe they had temporary problems when in reality he had lost a considerable amount of money due to poor financial decisions and irresponsible spending. Preston's lawyer quickly started gathering his papers. It was clear he had no idea of his client's true situation when he took the case. But most importantly, I continued, looking directly at Preston, all these actions constitute marital fraud, deception, and psychological abuse. My daughter has solid grounds, not only for divorce, but for a considerable lawsuit for damages. Preston finally found his voice. You can't do this. You planned all this. You set a trap for me. No, I replied firmly. I simply documented the truth, your actions, your decisions, your lies. I didn't force you to cheat. I didn't force you to lie about money. I didn't force you to humiliate me that night in your apartment. I stood up from my chair and walked over to where he was sitting. What I did do was make sure the consequences of your actions finally caught up with you. His lawyer nervously cleared his throat. Mrs. Sterling, I believe we can reach some kind of agreement. My client is prepared to withdraw all accusations. Of course, he will withdraw them, I replied, because now he understands that he has no case. But there is something else he needs to understand. I returned to my seat and pulled out the last document, a formal eviction notice. This is a 30-day notice, I announced. Due to multiple late rent payments, violations of the building's residency rules, and aggressive behavior toward other tenants and administrative staff, you are being evicted from the property. Preston stood up abruptly. You can't do that. I have rights. Yes, you do. I agreed. And they are all clearly established in the lease agreement you signed, a contract you have violated multiple times. Marcus intervened. Everything is completely legal. The eviction notice is based on documented violations of the lease, not personal revenge. Preston's lawyer quickly gathered his things. Mr. Hayes, I think we should leave. There is no case here. But Preston didn't move. He stood there looking at me with a mixture of hatred and despair. You destroyed my life, he said. No, I replied calmly. You destroyed your own life. I simply made sure my daughter knew the truth. They left the office in silence. Preston walked out like a zombie, completely defeated. His lawyer looked embarrassed and eager to end his association with the case. When they were gone, Marcus and I were left alone in the conference room. He started organizing the documents while I remained seated, processing everything that had just happened. How do you feel? Marcus asked me. I thought about his question for a long moment. How did I feel? It wasn't satisfaction I felt. Not exactly. It was something deeper, more complex. I feel at peace. I finally replied. For the first time in months, I feel completely at peace. The news of the eviction spread quickly through the building. Kevin told me that several tenants had expressed relief, especially after the incident of Preston yelling in the lobby and disturbing other residents. No one would regret seeing him leave. Simone received the news with a mix of complex emotions. On one hand, she felt relieved to know that Preston could no longer harass her in her former home. On the other hand, the reality that her marriage had officially ended hit her with a new force. It's strange. She told me that night as we ate dinner. For months, I've known my marriage was bad, but now that it's actually over, I feel lost. Like I don't know who I am without him. I understood perfectly what she meant. After James' death, I had felt the same way. When your identity has been tied to another person for so long, being alone feels like losing a part of yourself. That's normal, my love. I told her. But it's also an opportunity, a chance to rediscover who you really are without the limitations he imposed on you. Over the next few days, I watched as Preston completely fell apart. Kevin kept me informed of his desperate attempts to find another place to live. His financial situation was worse than I had imagined. The late rent payments weren't just due to his extravagant spending on his mistress. He was truly on the verge of bankruptcy. His mistress apparently had abandoned him as soon as she found out about his financial problems. Derek reported that she had started dating another man, someone with a better economic situation and without the complications of a pending divorce. A week before the eviction deadline, Preston made his last desperate attempt. He showed up at my house at 10 at night, completely drunk, begging for another chance. When I opened the door and saw him stumbling on my porch, his clothes disheveled and his breath smelling of liquor, I felt a mixture of pity and disgust. This was the man who had made me feel insignificant, who had treated me like trash. Now he was standing at my door, broken and desperate. "Please," he mumbled, "give me another chance. Can I pay the rent? Can I get the money?" "It's not about the money, Preston," I replied. "It's about the decisions you made. It's about how you treated the people you should have respected." "I was wrong," he continued, the words tumbling out. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything. Just let me stay in the apartment. Simone can stay with you. I won't bother her anymore." Simone had appeared behind me, woken up by the voices. When she saw Preston in that state, her expression changed from concern to something like contempt. Go, Preston," she said, her voice stronger than I had heard in months. "You don't have power over me anymore. You can't manipulate me with your tears and your empty promises." He looked at her with pleading eyes. "Simone, please, can we try again? Can I change?" "No," she replied firmly. "You had years to change. You had hundreds of opportunities to treat my mother right, to be honest with me, to be the man you promised to be when we got married. You chose not to." I closed the door softly but firmly. Through the window, we watched him stumble away toward the street, a pathetic figure who had lost everything because of his own arrogance and cruelty. The last few days before the eviction were chaotic. Preston hired a cheap moving company that arrived late and handled his belongings carelessly. Several tenants complained about the noise and commotion, but I assured them it would be the last time they would have to deal with that kind of disturbance. The day of the final eviction, I decided to be present, not out of cruelty, but because I wanted to make sure everything was done legally and properly. I also have to admit, it was because I wanted to see the end of this chapter with my own eyes. Preston looked like a ghost of himself. In just a few weeks, he had lost weight. His hair was messy, and his clothes, though expensive, were wrinkled and dirty. He carried a small suitcase in a cardboard box, apparently all that was left of his former life. When he saw me in the building lobby, he stopped. For a moment, I thought he was going to make another scene, but instead he just looked at me with empty eyes. "I hope you're satisfied," he said. "It's not about satisfaction," I replied. "It's about justice." He left without another word. Kevin and I watched from the office window as he got into an old cab with his few belongings. We didn't know where he was going, and frankly, we didn't care. "What are you going to do with the apartment now?" Kevin asked me. "I'm going to renovate it completely," I replied. "And then I'm going to rent it to a family who will truly appreciate it." That night, Simone and I celebrated quietly. It wasn't a celebration of Preston's downfall, but of the end of a painful chapter in our lives. We ate dinner at the kitchen table as we had done when she was a child, and we talked about the future. "What are you going to do now?" I asked her. "First, I'm going to find a job," she replied with determination. "I want to be financially independent. I never want to depend on someone who can use money to control me again." "You don't need to worry about the money," I said. "Now I have enough resources to know." "Mama," she gently interrupted me, "I need to do this for myself. I need to prove to myself that I can stand on my own 2 feet. I understood perfectly what she meant. independence wasn't just about money. It was about self-confidence, about rebuilding her identity as a strong, independent woman. But, she added with a small smile, I'd love to keep living here with you for a while if you don't mind. I've missed this. I've missed having a real family. Tears came to my eyes. This will always be your home over the next few weeks. I watched as Simone slowly returned to being the strong woman I had raised. She started actively looking for work, updated her resume, and bought new clothes with money she had secretly saved during the last months of her marriage. She also started going out more, reconnecting with friends she had lost during her marriage to Preston. She told me he had been very subtle in how he isolated her, always having an excuse why she couldn't see certain people, why certain events were inappropriate for them. It's terrifying, she told me one night, to realize how much of my life I had lost without even knowing how many decisions I had stopped making for myself. But the important thing, I replied, is that you realized it. Many women never do. One afternoon, while reviewing some documents in the building office, Kevin gave me some interesting news. A young family with 2 small children was interested in renting the apartment Preston had occupied. They were school teachers, hard-working people with excellent references. Perfect, I told him. Schedule an appointment for them to see the apartment. When I met the Williams family, I knew immediately they were exactly the kind of tenants I wanted. Maya, the mother, was a warm woman who reminded me of myself when I was young. Her husband, David, was quiet but clearly devoted to his family. Their 2 children, who were 5 and 7, were well-behaved and full of energy. It's perfect, Maya said after seeing the renovated apartment. The kids will have their own room, and the living area is perfect for doing homework. I offered them the apartment at a lower rent than Preston had been paying. Kevin looked at me in surprise, but I knew what I was doing. I wanted the building to be filled with real families, with good people who would create a positive atmosphere. Are you sure about the price? Maya asked me, clearly surprised by my generosity. Completely sure, I replied. Just make sure your children are happy here. 6 months after the day that changed my life forever, I woke up to my new morning routine. I was no longer the same woman who had walked out of that condo humiliated. I was no longer the lonely widow living off memories and a modest pension. I was Alara Sterling, businesswoman, property owner, independent woman, and above all, a mother who had gotten her daughter back. Simone had found a job at an accounting office downtown. It wasn't her dream job, but it gave her the independence she needed and the self-confidence she had lost during her marriage. Every morning, I watched her get ready for work with an energy I hadn't seen in years. Morning, Mama, she said that particular morning, giving me a kiss on the cheek before pouring herself some coffee. Got any plans for today? I'm going to check the properties on the south side, I replied. And then I have an important meeting. I didn't tell her what that meeting was. It was a surprise I had been planning for weeks. After Simone left for work, I put on my best burgundy suit, the one that made me feel powerful and elegant. I carefully fixed my hair and put on the pearl necklace James had given me for our last anniversary. I wanted to look perfect for what I had planned. My first stop was the apartment building where the Williams family now lived. The children had transformed the atmosphere of the place. Their laughter echoed in the halls, and other tenants had started commenting on how nice it was to have a happy young family in the building. Kevin greeted me with his monthly report. The building's finances were better than ever. The tenants paid promptly. There were no complaints of noise or disturbances, and the waiting list for available apartments was constantly growing. The change has been incredible since Mr. Hayes left, Kevin commented. It's like the whole building is breathing better. I smiled but didn't comment. Preston was part of the past, and I preferred to focus on the future. My second stop was Marcus King's office. Simone's divorce had been finalized the week before. Preston had not shown up for the final hearing, and the judge had granted everything we had requested. Simone was officially a free woman. "I have the final documents," Marcus said, handing me a thick envelope. "Your daughter can start her new life without any legal ties to the past." "Perfect," I replied. "And the other matter we discussed? Everything is ready," he confirmed with a smile. "The paperwork is prepared for whenever you need it." My third and most important stop was an office downtown. It was a modern, elegant building with windows overlooking the entire city. I went up to the 15th floor and walked to the reception desk of an organization I had been researching for weeks. "I have an appointment with the director," I told the receptionist. "Mrs. Sterling. They are expecting you." The director of the Phoenix House Foundation was a woman my age named Dr. Lena Wallace. She had dedicated her life to helping women in situations of domestic violence and psychological abuse. "Mrs. Sterling." She greeted me warmly. "It's a pleasure to meet you. Your proposal has deeply impressed us." We sat down in her office where she had prepared a presentation on the work they do. They help women escape abusive relationships. They provide temporary shelter, legal advice, psychological support, and job training so they can rebuild their lives. As I explained over the phone, I said, "I want to make a considerable donation to your organization, but I also want to propose something more ambitious." I pulled out the documents Marcus had prepared. It was the deed to one of my properties, an apartment building in a safe neighborhood of Atlanta. I want to donate this entire building to be converted into transitional housing for women escaping abusive relationships. I announced apartments where they can live with their children without paying rent until they are financially stable. Dr. Wallace's eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Sterling, this would change the lives of dozens of families. We could help so many women we currently can't assist due to lack of space." "There is one condition," I added. "I want to be personally involved. I want to meet the women you help. I want to hear their stories. I want to be part of their healing process." "Of course," she immediately replied. "Your personal experience would be invaluable to the women we help." I signed the donation papers that very afternoon. It was the most important decision I had made with my new fortune, more important even than getting my daughter back or getting revenge on Preston. That night, when Simone returned from work, I was waiting for her in the living room with a glass of wine and the final documents for her divorce. "What's this?" she asked, taking the envelope. "Your official freedom," I replied. "You are no longer married to Preston. Legally, emotionally, completely free." Simone opened the envelope and read the documents. When she finished, she sat next to me on the sofa and hugged me. "Thank you, Mama, for everything. For taking me in when I arrived, broken. For paying the lawyer. For giving me time to heal. For never giving up on me. I have some other news, too," I said. "Today, I donated one of my buildings to create housing for women leaving abusive relationships." Simone looked at me with admiration. "Mama, that's wonderful. You're going to help so many women, and I want you to be involved too, if you want. These women will need support, someone who understands what they've been through." "Of course," she replied without hesitation. "I would love to help." We sat in silence for a few moments, each lost in her own thoughts. Finally, Simone spoke. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't inherited the money? If you had never had the power to get revenge on Preston?" It was a question I had asked myself many times. "I think the truth would have come out eventually," I replied. "Men like Preston always destroy themselves. The money just sped up the process. And do you think we would have found our way back to each other?" "Yes," I replied without hesitation, "because the love between a mother and a daughter is stronger than any manipulation. The money gave me tools, but love would have brought us back together either way." 3 months later, I attended the official inauguration of the Phoenix House Transition Center. It was the building I had donated, completely renovated, and converted into 8 beautiful functional apartments for families in transition. The first tenant was a young woman named Chloe with 2 small children. She had left an abusive marriage and was starting over just like Simone had. When I handed her the keys to her new temporary home, I saw in her eyes the same gratitude and determination that I had seen in my daughter's eyes. "This is only temporary," I told her. "A safe place while you build your new life." "I understand," she replied. "And thank you not just for the apartment, but for showing me that it is possible to get back on my feet." That night, back in my house, I sat in my favorite chair with a cup of chamomile tea. Simone was in her room talking on the phone with one of the friends she had reconnected with. Her laughter filled the house with music I had missed for far too long. I thought about everything that had happened in less than 1 year. The humiliation, the loneliness, the discovery of the inheritance, the revenge, the reconciliation, and finally peace. Preston had completely disappeared from our lives. According to the last reports I had received, he was living in a rented room on the outskirts of town, working in insurance sales. His former life of luxury and arrogance was just a distant memory. But I didn't think about him with hatred or satisfaction. I thought about him with the indifference we reserve for people who no longer hold power over our lives. My phone rang, interrupting my reflections. It was Dr. Wallace from the Foundation. "Ara, we have our first graduation," she told me excitedly. "Chloe got a stable job and is moving into her own apartment next week. That's wonderful. She's ready, more than ready. And she wants you to be there when she leaves to thank you personally." After hanging up, I stayed seated in the darkness of my living room, listening to the sounds of my daughter moving around the house, feeling more complete than I had felt in years. James would have been proud, I thought. Proud of the woman I had become. Proud of the way I had protected our daughter. Proud of how I had used my new fortune, not just for personal justice, but to help other women. I got up and walked to the window. The city stretched out before me, full of lights and possibilities. Somewhere in that city were women who needed help, who needed hope, who needed to know that it was possible to get back on their feet. And I would be there for them just as someone had been there for me when I needed it most. "I forgive you," I whispered into the night. But I wasn't talking to Preston. I forgive myself for wasting so much time feeling small, for forgetting my own worth, for allowing someone else to define who I was. Because that finally was the true victory. Not the revenge against Preston, not the money, not the power. The true victory was remembering who I had always been. Ara, a strong woman, a protective mother, a person worthy of respect and love. And that woman had been there all along, patiently waiting to be rediscovered. I'm really glad you're here and that I could share my story with you. If you liked it, show me by liking the video and subscribing to my channel. Let's see how many of us there are. Write in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is. I'm so curious to know where all you wonderful people are tuning in from. If you want to support me a little extra, you can also send a small donation. I share new life stories for you every single day.